Your boys don't need all this space, Margaret announced, waving her hand dismissively at my twins' carefully decorated rooms. Cassidy needs a proper study environment for college. The boys can share the guest room downstairs. I stood in the doorway of my son's bedrooms, my hands clenched into fists as I watched my mother-in-law systematically dismantle the spaces my 10-year-old twins, Oliver and Noah, had called their own since birth. The rooms that held their treasured book collections, science projects, and the glow-in-the-dark star maps we spent weekends perfecting. My name is Emma Sullivan, and at 35, I never imagined I'd be fighting to protect my children's spaces in their own home. But here I was, watching Margaret, my mother-in-law, commandeer the rooms for her precious Cassidy, my 18-year-old stepsister-in-law, who'd just been accepted to the local university. The guest room is half the size of one of their current rooms, I protested, keeping my voice level despite the anger bubbling inside. They need space for their homework, their projects. Oh, please, Margaret cut me off, already measuring the walls with her tape measure. Boys their age should be outside playing, not cooped up with books and science kits. Cassidy is going to medical school. She needs a proper setup. I bit back a sharp retort. Margaret had moved in with us 3 months ago after her husband's passing, bringing Cassidy with her. My husband James, ever the dutiful son, had insisted they stay with us until they got back on their feet. But Margaret's temporary stay was quickly becoming a hostile takeover. James and I need to discuss this first, I said firmly. These are our children's rooms. James already agreed. Margaret smiled, that smug, knowing smile that made my blood boil. He understands the importance of Cassidy's education. After all, she's following in his footsteps. Unlike your boys, who, she paused, her implication clear. My twins were gifted, but in ways Margaret refused to acknowledge. Oliver was already reading at a high school level and had won the state science fair twice. Noah was a mathematical prodigy who taught himself coding. But to Margaret, they were just rough and tumble boys who needed to toughen up. The boys will be home from their robotics club soon, I said, checking my watch. At least let me explain. No time like the present to start moving things. Margaret interrupted, already pulling books from the shelves. Cassidy needs to set up her study station before classes start next week. The guest room has a perfectly good bunk bed. The boys will adjust. I watched in horror as she carelessly tossed my son's books into boxes, their carefully organized collections mixed together without any regard for their system. When she knocked over Oliver's prized crystal growing experiment, sending purple crystals scattering across the floor, something inside me snapped. Stop, I commanded, my voice carrying an authority that made Margaret freeze. You don't touch another thing until I speak with James. Don't be dramatic, Margaret scoffed. But I noticed she'd set down the box she was holding. James knows what's best for this family. He wants Cassidy to have every advantage. And what about his son's advantages? I challenged. Their right to have their own space in their own home. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Their own home. Last I checked, James bought this house. You were just a kindergarten teacher when he married you. What could you have possibly contributed? Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to show how much they stung. What Margaret didn't know, what even James didn't fully appreciate, was exactly how much of this house belonged to me. I'd inherited a significant sum from my grandmother, money I quietly invested in our home purchase, insisting on having my name on the deed. But before I could respond, I heard the front door open and excited voices float up the stairs. The boys were home. My heart clenched as I imagined their faces when they saw their rooms being dismantled. Mom, Oliver's voice called out. You won't believe what we built today. Up here, sweetie, I called back, shooting Margaret a warning look. Wait in the kitchen. I'll be right down. But it was too late. I heard their footsteps thundering up the stairs, their excitement palpable. They appeared in the doorway, still in their science club t-shirts, matching grins on their faces, grins that faltered as they took in the scene before them. What's happening to our rooms? Noah asked, his voice small. Margaret straightened up, assuming her most authoritative pose. Boys were making some changes. Cassidy needs a proper study space for college, so you'll be sharing the guest room downstairs. It'll be an adventure. I watched my son's faces crumple, saw the confusion and hurt in her eyes. Oliver clutched his project closer to his chest. Some sort of robot they'd built at the club. while Noah's lower lip trembled slightly. But my star maps, Oliver whispered, looking at the constellations we'd spent months researching and placing on his ceiling. And my coding corner, Noah added, staring at his dismantled desk setup. Those childish decorations need to go anyway, Margaret declared. It's time you boys grew up a little. I'd never been a confrontational person, had always tried to keep the peace, especially for James's sake. But watching my children's faces, seeing their safe spaces being stripped away by this woman who'd steamrolled her way into our lives, something crystallized inside me. Boys, I said calmly, go downstairs and have your snack. Nothing is being moved today. Your rooms are staying exactly as they are. Margaret's face reddened. Now see here. No, I cut her off, my voice steel. You see here. I'm going to my office to get something. When I come back, we're going to have a very interesting conversation about property ownership and legal rights. And then, Margaret, you and I are going to discuss the real meaning of family. I walked into my home office, hands trembling slightly as I unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Inside, carefully preserved in a blue folder, was the original deed to our house. I kept it here rather than in our joint files, a decision that now seemed almost prophetic. As I pulled it out, my grandmother's last words to me echoed in my mind. Always keep something of your own, dear. Love with your whole heart, but protect yourself with your head. At the time, I thought she was being paranoid. Now I understood. When I returned to the boys' rooms, Margaret was on the phone with James. Your wife is being completely unreasonable. The boys don't need. She stopped abruptly when she saw me in the doorway. James will be home in 20 minutes, she announced triumphantly. He'll sort this out. Perfect, I replied, my voice steady. We can all discuss this together. I spent those 20 minutes helping the twins gather the pieces of Oliver's scattered crystal experiment, listening as they talked about their robotics project. Their resilience amazed me. Even now, they were excitedly explaining their new coding algorithm, though I could see the worry in their eyes whenever they glanced at their half-packed rooms. When James's key turned in the lock, Margaret practically flew down the stairs. I took a deep breath and followed, the deed tucked securely under my arm. Emma, what's this about? James demanded as I entered the living room. He looked tired, his doctor's coat still on, with Margaret standing smugly beside him. Mom says you're blocking Cassidy's study space arrangement. Study space arrangement? I repeated, keeping my voice level. You mean giving away our son's rooms without even discussing it with me? The boys can share, James sighed, running a hand through his hair. Cassidy needs. What about what your sons need? I interrupted. Their books, their projects, their privacy. They're just boys, Margaret interjected. Cassidy is going to medical school. She needs to take over my children's spaces, to dismiss their achievements. I pulled out the deed, laying it on the coffee table. Let's talk about needs, starting with who actually owns this house. James frowned. Emma, I bought this house. You know that. No, I said firmly. We bought this house. And more specifically, I opened the deed, pointing to the ownership details. I own 60% of it. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret snatched up the document, her face growing redder as she read. This must be a mistake, she spluttered. James, did you know about this? James was staring at me, realization dawning in his eyes. Your inheritance, he said slowly. The down payment, I always assumed it was a small portion. My grandmother left me enough to buy this house outright, I explained. But I wanted us to build this life together, so I only covered 60%. What I didn't expect was for my children's spaces to be given away without my consent. But Cassidy's education, Margaret began, is important, I finished, but not more important than my son's well-being, not in their own home. Our home, James corrected quietly, and I saw something shift in his expression. I'm sorry, Emma. I should have discussed this with you first. Margaret wasn't giving up so easily. This is ridiculous. Those boys are downstairs right now playing with robots while Cassidy is trying to become a doctor. She needs to find her own apartment. I cut in. In fact, Margaret, I think it's time we discussed your living arrangements too. What? She gasped. James, are you going to let her? Mom, James interrupted, and I heard the weariness in his voice. Emma's right. We've been unfair to the boys. And maybe it's time you and Cassidy found your own place. Margaret's face went from red to purple. After everything I've done for this family, I raised you to be a doctor, supported your career, and this is how you repay me? By letting her dictate. By standing up for my sons, James corrected. He turned to me and I saw guilt in his eyes. I've been so focused on helping Mom and Cassidy that I forgot my first responsibility is to our boys. I heard movement on the stairs and turned to see Oliver and Noah peering through the banister rails. Their faces showed a mix of hope and uncertainty. Your rooms are yours, I called up to them. No one is moving anywhere. The smiles that broke across their faces made every moment of confrontation worth it. They thundered down the stairs, launching themselves into my arms. Does this mean we can finish our robot? Oliver asked excitedly. And I can keep my coding corner? Noah added. Yes to both, James answered, joining our hug. In fact, why don't you show me this robot? I haven't been paying enough attention to your projects lately. As James followed the boys upstairs, their chatter filling the house with familiar warmth, I turned back to Margaret. She stood rigid, clutching the deed like it had personally offended her. You've ruined everything, she hissed. Cassidy's future is hers to build, I finished. Just like my son's futures are theirs to build. In their own rooms, in their own home. The next few weeks brought changes I never expected. Margaret and Cassidy found an apartment near the university within days. Apparently, my revelation about the house ownership had shattered their illusion of control. They moved out on a Saturday morning, Margaret maintaining a frosty silence while Cassidy shot resentful glances at the twins' rooms. You've destroyed this family, Margaret declared as she carried out her last box. Don't expect us at Christmas. I almost laughed at her attempt at emotional manipulation. Family isn't about taking from each other, Margaret. It's about supporting each other's growth, all of us, not just your chosen ones. After they left, the house felt lighter somehow. James spent that afternoon with the boys in their rooms, truly seeing their interests for the first time in months. I stood in the doorway, watching as Oliver explained his crystal experiments and Noah demonstrated his coding projects. Dad, look, Oliver exclaimed, pointing to his star map. Each constellation has a story. Mom helped me research them all. And I built this program to track the moon phases, Noah added, pulling up his laptop. Want to see? The pride on James's face brought tears to my eyes. He'd been so caught up in pleasing his mother and supporting Cassidy's dreams that he'd nearly missed the amazing achievements of his own sons. That evening, after the boys were asleep, James and I sat on the back porch with cups of tea. I had no idea about the house, he said quietly. Why didn't you tell me the full extent of your investment? I took a sip of tea, gathering my thoughts. At first, I wanted us to feel equal in this. Then, as years passed, it just seemed easier to keep it quiet. Until my mother tried to take over our children's spaces, he finished, shame coloring his voice. I've been blind, Emma, to how she treats the boys, to how she dismisses their interests. She's your mother, I said gently. You wanted to help her after losing your father. I understand that, but our sons needed you too. A week later, we received a call from Margaret. Cassidy was struggling with her classes, feeling overwhelmed by the medical school prerequisites. She wanted to change her major to art history, something Margaret considered beneath the family standards. This is your fault, Margaret accused. If she had the proper study space. If she had the freedom to choose her own path, I corrected. Like my boys have the freedom to pursue their interests. How was that a bad thing? The line went quiet for a moment. Then, surprisingly, it was Cassidy who spoke. Emma, can I come over sometime? To talk? That conversation marked another shift. Cassidy visited the following weekend, and for the first time she really saw her nephews. She sat with Oliver as he explained his latest science project, genuine interest replacing her previous disdain. She even asked Noah to show her some basic coding. I never realized, she admitted to me later. Mom always made it seem like their interests were silly compared to medical school. But they're really smart, aren't they? They are, I agreed. And so are you, Cassidy, even if you choose art history over medicine. Tears filled her eyes. I wish Mom understood that. 2 months after the confrontation, our home had found a new rhythm. The boys' rooms remained their sanctuaries, now enhanced by James's active involvement in their projects. He helped Oliver set up a proper crystal growing station and worked with Noah to upgrade his computer setup. Margaret maintained her distance, but Cassidy became a regular visitor. She switched her major officially, much to her mother's horror, and found unexpected support from James. "You defended your son's right to be themselves," he told me one night. "Made me realize I needed to do the same for my sister." The twins thrived in their secure spaces. Oliver's crystal collection grew, carefully cataloged in notebooks filled with his observations. Noah's coding projects expanded, his confidence growing with each successful program. Their rooms reflected their personalities and passions, no longer under threat of being erased. One evening, as I tucked them in, Oliver asked, "Mom, are you glad you kept the house papers safe?" I smiled, smoothing his hair. "Very glad. But you know what I'm even more glad about?" "What?" both boys asked. "That you never have to doubt your place in this home again. Your rooms, your interests, your dreams, they matter. Don't let anyone tell you differently." Later, looking through old photos, I found one of my grandmother. She stood proud in front of her own home, the one she'd worked so hard to keep. I finally understood the full weight of her advice about keeping something of my own. It wasn't just about property or money. It was about having the power to protect what matters most. James came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "The boys want to show us their new joint project. Something about combining crystals and computer modeling." I leaned back into his embrace, grateful for how far we'd come. Then we shouldn't keep them waiting. As we headed upstairs to our sons' rooms, their safe spaces, their domains of creativity and growth, I sent a silent thank you to my grandmother. Her wisdom had helped me protect not just a house, but a home where every member of our family could flourish exactly as they were meant to be.